The signal that called humanity to war was 3 seconds of a maintenance tone that no living thing had meant to send. It happened at the bottom of a third shift, on a planet called Veshan Drum, in a gray concrete listening hall built into the side of a cold mountain, and the only one awake to hear it was a clerk named EU Marn. You should know what IU was, because you are the kind of creature he was working for, and you would have done exactly what his masters did. You would have called it nothing. You would have logged it and gone back to sleep. IU Marn was 41 cycles old, and he had no rank worth saying out loud. He kept the test tones. That was his whole life. Every shift he walked the long racks of the relay hall, and he made each old transmitter cough out its little proof-of-life sound, a flat 3-second note, so that the great machine above all of them could tick a box that said the relay still worked. He was not a soldier. He had never held a weapon. He had a sore back, a bad knee, and a small gray bird in a cage by his desk that he had named after his mother, because it sang when he came in. On the night it happened, transmitter 49 stuck. He heard it before he saw it. The tone went out, and then it did not stop. A flat note that should have died at 3 seconds kept going. 4, 5, 6. A held breath of sound pouring up the racks and into the dish on the mountain's crown. And Iu got up too fast, and felt his knee bark at him, and he limped down the row to kill it. He found the relay glowing. Not bright, just awake in a way the dead old machines around it were not. A connector had corroded through, and welded itself shut, and the test tone had no off, and the dish above was throwing that flat-held note out into the dark on a band the maps did not name. EU reached for the manual cut. His hand stopped before it got there. Because the band the dish was throwing into was the silent band, the forbidden quarter, the part of the sky his masters had taught every clerk to fear without ever once explaining why. There was a single line in the old manual, and IU had read it 1,000 times. Do not transmit on the low quiet channel. Anything heard there is to be erased and never spoken of. He had always thought it was superstition, a dead rule from a dead war. But standing there in the dark, with the held tone pouring up out of the mountain, he felt the back of his neck go cold, because the manual did not say what would happen if you broke the rule. It only said the rule. He pulled the cut. The tone died, the relay went dark. The hall was quiet again, just the hum of the cooling, and the small gray bird shifting on its perch, and IU Marn stood there, with his hand on the cold metal, and his heart going hard, and he told himself it was nothing. It had lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds of a stuck maintenance note, thrown by accident into a part of the sky no one was supposed to touch. He logged it as a fault. He wrote the words corroded connector, and held tone and isolated, and he went back to his desk, and he gave the gray bird a seed through the bars, and he tried very hard to forget the cold thing that had walked up his spine. 4 days later, the silent band answered. It did not answer the way a machine answers. It did not come back as a tone, or a code, or a number. It came back as words, in the old trade speech that every species in the Reach could read, slow and plain and certain, and it was waiting in the relay log when IU came in for his shift. He read it standing up. He read it 4 times. Then he sat down very carefully, because his knee would not hold him. The message was 11 words long. We heard a voice in the dark. We are coming home. EU Marn did not know yet that home was not his world. He did not know that the thing that had heard 9 seconds of a stuck tone had been listening to that band for 900 years, the way a creature listens for the one sound it has been waiting its whole life to hear. He did not know that the word coming, in the mouth that had sent it, did not mean a ship. It meant a fleet. He only knew that he had been told, all his life, that nothing lived in the silent quarter, and that the silent quarter had just told him otherwise, in 11 calm words, and that he was now the single creature on Veshan Drum, holding a secret too big for the room he sat in. He looked up at the rack of dead transmitters. He looked at the small gray bird. He looked at the line in the old manual that said, erase and never speak of it. And then, because IU Marn was a clerk and not a coward, and because the words on his screen had said home, in a voice that sounded like it had been heard a long time ago, he did the one thing his masters would have killed him for. He did not erase it. He answered. To understand why EU's masters would have killed him, you have to understand what ruled the Reach. and you have to understand it the way EU did not. All at once, with his hand still shaking on the desk. The Reach was ruled by the stillness. That was the polite word. The word the stillness used for itself in its own announcements was the quieting concord, and it had governed 1100 worlds for 9 centuries. And it did not rule with fleets. It ruled with silence. This is the part you already know, because you live under it, so let the clerk catch up. The stillness did not kill worlds. It hushed them. When a world spoke too loudly, when it asked the wrong question, or reached for the wrong neighbor, the stillness did not send an armada. It sent a severing. A thing that reached into the deep machinery that let a world hear and be heard, and it cut. Not the bodies. The connection. After a severing, a world could still breathe and eat and build. It simply could no longer call out, and no call could reach it. And its own people slowly forgot that calling was a thing that creatures did. 310 worlds had been hushed in 900 years. They were still out there. EU had flown over 2 of them as a boy on a freight run, and he remembered how they looked from orbit, lights still on, cities still warm, and not one signal coming up from the surface. Not one. A planet full of people who had been taught that the sky was empty and that no one was ever going to answer them, because anyone who answered would be hushed too. That was the stillness. It did not win by being strong. It won by making sure that no one who needed help could ever be heard asking for it. It cut the throat of the call itself. After enough generations, the world stopped trying, and a creature that has stopped trying to call for help is the easiest thing in the void to own. And the silent band, the low quiet channel that Liu had been forbidden to touch, was the one band the stillness had never managed to sever. It was the oldest channel in the Reach. It went down below the levels the severing could reach, into the deep cold structure of the dark itself, and 9 centuries ago, the first throne of the stillness had done the only thing it could do with a channel it could not cut. It had banned it. It had told every world that the silent band was death, that nothing lived there, that to speak on it was to be erased, and the worlds had believed it, because the alternative was to wonder what their masters were so afraid of. EU Marn did not know any of this when he answered. He learned it in pieces over the next 11 days, as the calm voice on the silent band told him, gently, one careful message at a time, the way you tell a frightened animal a hard truth. The voice called itself the Long Watch. It told IU that 900 years ago, before the stillness had finished hushing the Reach, a single small people from a world they would not name had been hushed too. Severed. Cut off from the sky. And that this people had done a thing no hushed world had ever done. They had refused to forget that calling was real. They had built, in secret, under their own dead silence, a way to listen on the one band the stillness could not cut, the silent band. And they had kept watch on it for 900 years, generation after generation in the cold dark, waiting for the day that some other world, somewhere, would do by accident what they could no longer do on purpose. Speak into the silent band. Ask, even without meaning to, the question the stillness had spent 9 centuries making sure no one could ask. Is anyone there? IU had asked it by accident, with a corroded connector and a stuck note, for 9 seconds, and the Long Watch had been waiting 900 years to hear it. He wrote back, his hands no longer steady at all. He typed the only thing that mattered, the thing a clerk types when he finally understands he is in the middle of something far past his rank. You should not come. If they hear you, they will hush you. They hushed 310 worlds. You are one voice. They are 1100 worlds. Please, you will die. The answer took 2 days. It came in the deep cold of a third shift, with the gray bird asleep and the hall dark, and IU read it and felt something in his chest break open that he had thought was sealed shut for good. We are not one voice. We are the ones who never stopped answering. We have been building, friend. You did not call a ship. Go to your window. Look up. EU went to the window. The relay hall was set into a mountain, and from the clerk's window, you could see a thin band of the night sky between 2 peaks, the same patch of stars EU had looked at every shift for 19 years, and never once seen change. It was changing now. Out past the cold edge of the system, where the maps drew the silent quarter as a blank gray nothing, the dark was filling up with light, not stars, Stars did not move in formation. Stars did not arrive. The blank gray quarter the stillness had told every child was empty, was opening like a door. And through it, slow and certain, and without one shred of hurry, came hulls. He stopped counting at 40. He could not see them all. They came on banked and dark, running cold, no broadcast, no boast, length after length of them sliding out of the gray, and the lead hull was so large that EU first mistook it for a moon that had not been there an hour ago. It came on like weather, like a tide, like the slow front edge of something that had decided, a very long time ago, exactly where it was going, and exactly what it was going to do when it got there. On its flank, in letters the size of cities, in the old trade speech so that any creature in the reach could read it, was the name the Long Watch had given its flagship. We never stopped listening. Hugh Marn stood at his small window with his hand against the cold glass, and he understood, all at once, that he was looking at the answer to a question that 310 dead quiet worlds had been forbidden to ask, and that the answer had a hull the size of a moon, and that it was coming home to a home that had been taken from it 900 years ago, and that nothing his masters had ever built was going to be able to make it be quiet. The stillness saw the fleet the same hour IU did. Of course it did. It had eyes everywhere. Eyes were cheaper than guns when you ruled by silence. The blank quarter lit up with hulls and the great machinery of the quieting Concorde turned its attention, for the first time in 900 years, to the band it had banned. And the stillness was not afraid. You have to know that. You would not have been afraid either. The stillness had hushed 310 worlds. It had a tool that cut the throat of any call. It looked at a fleet, however large, and it thought the thing every ruler by silence thinks. Let them come. We do not fight fleets. We make it so no one can hear them. A fleet that cannot be heard is not a fleet. It is a funeral that has not noticed it is over. So the stillness reached out, the way it had reached out 310 times before, and it severed the band the human fleet was coming on. It cut the silent channel at its own end, sawed through the deep, cold structure of the dark, and it closed the door behind the fleet so that the fleet could not be heard, could not call ahead, could not coordinate, could not be answered by any world it tried to free. It was a perfect move. It had worked 310 times. It did not work. EU watched it not work from his window, and he did not understand what he was seeing until the Long Watch explained it to him. Later, in the patient way it explained everything. But what he saw was this. The blank quarter flickered as the severing went out. The silent band, the channel the fleet was riding, died. The deep cold structure of the dark was cut, and the fleet kept coming, exactly as before, not one hull slower, because the Long Watch had spent 900 years preparing for precisely this, the only move the stillness had, and the humans had built a fleet that did not need to be heard to know where it was going. The stillness severed the band. The humans had stopped using the band as anything but a doorbell the day they answered. The doorbell had done its job. Now they were already inside, and they did not need it anymore. The message that came up to EU's relay then did not come on the silent band, because the silent band was dead. It came on every band at once, on the stillness's own channels, on the hushed world's frequencies, on the relay racks IU tended, and 10,000 racks like them across 1,100 worlds. And it was the first thing the Reach had heard come from outside the stillness's permission in 900 years. It was the human fleet, breaking the silence the only way silence can be broken, by speaking through it. The message was the same 11 words it had sent IU on the first day, but now it went to every world at once, every hushed and quieted and forgotten world, every place that had been taught the sky was empty, all of them, in one voice that could not be cut, because it was already through the wall. We heard a voice in the dark, "We are coming home." EU Marn put both hands over his mouth. Across 310 hushed worlds, in cities that had not heard a call from the sky in 9 centuries, people stopped walking. They looked up. Children who had been taught that the sky was a flat dead lid heard a voice come down out of it, a voice that said it had heard them, a voice that said home, and on the world called Tethys Low, a woman in a grain market fell to her knees, not from grief, but because her legs simply stopped holding her, because the thing she had been told all her life was a lie, that no one was listening, that no one would ever come, had just been undone in 11 words by a voice with a hull the size of a moon behind it. The stillness did the only thing it had ever known how to do. It severed harder. It threw everything it had at the call. It cut bands, it closed channels, it hushed whole regions of sky at once, burning out 900 years of careful silence machinery in a single afternoon trying to make the voice stop. And every band it cut, the human fleet had already abandoned. Every channel it closed, the humans were already past. The stillness was a creature that had spent 9 centuries learning to win by cutting the one wire that carried the call, and it had finally met a people who had stopped needing the wire. You cannot hush a fleet that has already arrived. Yu's relay hall filled with light as every rack he tended woke at once, carrying the human voice down to the surface of Veshin Drum, and the door of the hall slammed open behind him, and Yu turned, and standing in the doorway was the one creature he had been most afraid of in his whole small life. His overseer, a senior officer of the quieting Concord, a tall gray shape with the cut mark of the stillness on its collar, the rank that walked the relay worlds and made sure clerks like Yu erased what they were told to erase. The overseer's name was Sarn Vale, and Sarn Vale had read the log. It crossed the hall in 4 strides, and it took Yu by the front of his coat, and it lifted him half off his feet, and its voice when it spoke was the flat, dead calm of a creature that has never once been disobeyed. You answered it, you, a clerk. You answered the silent band. Do you understand what you have done? You have called the end of the world down onto 1100 worlds. They will be hushed, all of them, and it will be your name in the record as the one who opened the door. And Yu Marn, who was 41 cycles old and had never held a weapon and had a sore back and a bad knee and a small gray bird in a cage, looked up at the overseer of the stillness, and he did the second thing in his life that his masters would have killed him for. He told the truth. I did not call them, he said. I made a mistake. A connector corroded, and a tone stuck, and I sent 9 seconds of nothing into a band you told me was empty. And they answered. And do you understand what that means? It means they were there. It means they have been there the whole time, for 900 years, listening, on the one band you could not cut, waiting for one of us to make a mistake, big enough to be heard. You did not keep the sky empty, you only kept us from looking. And now one clerk has looked, and the sky is full, and you cannot unlook us. You cannot hush something that everyone has already seen. Sarnvale's grip did not loosen, but something moved behind its gray eyes, something Yu had never seen in an officer of the stillness, something that the stillness had spent 900 years making sure its own people never felt. It was the beginning of doubt. Outside, between the 2 cold peaks, the flagship of the Long Watch crossed the face of the smaller moon, and for a moment, the whole relay hall went dark in its shadow, and then bright again on its far side, and the 11 words came down through every rack one more time, and Sarn Vale, overseer of the quieting Concord, heard them with its own 2 ears, in its own gray hall, on its own world, a voice from the dark that said it had come home. It set Yu down. It did not let go of his coat, but it set him down, and it stood there with its hand still gripping the cloth, listening, and Yu understood that he was watching a creature hear, for the first time in its life, the sound it had spent its life making sure no one could hear. Someone was answering. Someone had always been willing to answer. The stillness had simply made it a crime to call. Far out past the peaks, the fleet of the Long Watch settled into the high dark over Veshin Drum, 61 hulls of it, dark and patient and cold, and did not fire, and did not speak again, and waited, because the Long Watch had learned a long time ago that the cruelest thing you can do to a creature that rules by silence is to simply refuse to stop being heard. Before the cutter ships came, before the great engine woke, the stillness tried the thing it had always tried first, the thing that had worked 310 times, and Yu watched it fail from his window, and did not yet understand that he was watching the whole war decided in the first hour. The stillness sent a single severing skiff ahead of its fleet, a small pale thing, fast, carrying one cutting engine, the kind the Concord used to test a target before it committed the heavy ships. The skiff was crewed by 9, and its job was simple. Fly close to the lead human hull, reach into the deep band that every ship in the reach used to think and steer and speak to itself, and saw it, cut the human flagship off from its own mind, make it deaf and dumb and blind, a moon-sized hull drifting with no one able to tell its own guns what to do. The stillness had done this to warships before, in the old days, before it ruled, and the warships had gone dark and dead and easy. The skiff flew its run. EU held his breath at the window. The skiff reached the flank of We Never Stopped Listening, and it turned its cutting engine on the band where the human ship's mind should have been, and it sawed, and it found nothing there. Not a weak signal, not a hidden one, nothing. The band was empty. The humans did not put their mind on a band. The crew of the skiff had spent their lives learning to find the wire that carried a ship's thinking and cut it, and they flew the length of a moon-sized human hull and could not find a single wire to cut, because the humans, 900 years severed, had built a ship that thought the way IU's gray bird flew, every part of it watching every other part, no center, no wire, no throat to slit. The skiff made 3 passes. On the third, the human flagship, which had not moved and had not fired, did the only thing it did to the skiff in the whole encounter. It turned on a light. A single broad light, pale and steady, that washed over the skiff and lit it up against the dark, and on every band at once, to the skiff, and to Oryu's hull, and to the 400 cutters still gathering in the deep. We Never Stopped Listening said 9 words. We see you. We are not going to hide. The skiff fled back to the fleet. EU would learn later that its crew of 9 could not be made to fly a second run, not by any order, because they had felt, in that light, the thing the stillness had built its whole power to prevent. They had been seen, found, known. A creature that has spent its life cutting the call so that no one can ever be located, had, for one moment, been located itself, gently, by a thing that did not even bother to fire, and it had not been able to bear it. The stillness logged the skiff's failure, and told itself it meant nothing. 9. Against a fleet. A scout. It called the 400. But the crew of that skiff carried something back into the Concorde that no order could untell. The knowledge that the human ships could not be cut, and could not be hidden from. And that knowledge moved through the fleet faster than any band, the way the truth always does, crew to crew, until 400 cutter ships full of creatures who had never once been afraid, began, very quietly, for the first time, to be. While the cutters sat dark over Veshin Drum, and the great engine was still days from waking, the stillness made a quieter move, and it was the most dangerous one of all, because it did not come for the human fleet at all. It came for EU. The stillness understood, the way old powers always understand, that the war was not really being fought in the high dark. It was being fought in the relay hall, on the racks, on the one channel that still carried a voice the Reach could hear. As long as the human voice came down to the surface and out across the worlds, the silence kept lifting. Cut that one thread, the stillness reasoned, and the fleet above could be as loud as it liked, and no one below would hear it. So the stillness did not send a ship, it sent an order, down the chain of the Concorde, to the few relay world officers who had not yet sat down on the floor and wept, an order to take the relay halls offline, to pull the racks, to go dark on purpose, every listening world at once, so that the human voice would have nothing to come down through, and the Reach would be deaf again, and the war would be lost to the only thing the stillness had ever needed, the simple turning off of the means to hear. The order reached Veshin Drum, it reached Sarn Vale, because Sarn Vale was still, in the records, the overseer of the hall, and the order was to Sarn Vale by name. Pull the racks, silence the hall, end the transmission. Do it now. EU watched the gray overseer read the order. He did not say anything. He had only known Sarn Vale as a thing to be afraid of, and he did not yet know which way the creature would turn, and he understood that everything, the whole Reach, 310 worlds, the fleet's whole 900-year hope, came down now to whether one gray officer, raised its whole life to obey, could learn in a single afternoon to disobey. Sarn Vale read the order 3 times. Then it walked to the main rack, the one that carried the human voice, and it put its gray hand on the cutoff, the master switch that would silence the hall and end the transmission, and obey the stillness. And it stood there, with its hand on the switch for a long time, and EU did not breathe. And then Sarnvale took its hand off the switch. It turned to the rack and it sent, back up the chain, to the Concorde, to the throne, a reply, in the careful gray hand of a creature using its own name to say no for the first time in its life. The hall stays open. I have heard the worlds we hushed. I will not deafen them again. If you want this hall silent, you will have to come and silence it yourself, and you will have to do it while it is playing you the voice of every world you cut, and I do not think you can. I do not think any of us can, anymore. We have heard. You cannot make us unhear. Then, Sarnvale turned off the cutoff entirely, ripped the switch from its housing with its own hands so that the hall could not be silenced even by accident, and laid it on the floor next to the cut mark it had already taken from its collar, and across the reach. On relay world after relay world, other officers who had also heard the voices made the same choice, one by one, because the stillness had given the order to deafen the reach to the only people left who could carry it out, and those people had just spent a night listening to what deafness had cost, and not one of them could do it. The stillness gave the order to go silent, and discovered that it no longer had anyone willing to make the silence. It had ruled for 900 years by being the only one who could turn the call off, and in a single night, every hand that had ever turned it off had learned to leave it on. The human voice kept coming down, the relay halls stayed open, and the stillness, having failed to deafen the reach, was left with only its ships and its great engine, and the dwindling, terrible understanding that the thing it had always relied on, the willingness of its own people to enforce the quiet, was gone, and was not coming back, and had been taken from it not by a fleet, but by a clerk, and a stuck tone, and a gray overseer, who learned, too late for the stillness, and just in time for everyone else, how to say the word no. The stillness gathered its strength, the way an old power always does, slowly, certainly, and entirely sure it would win. It called its severing ships in from across the reach. Not warships in the way you would mean it. Not gun hulls, because the stillness had never needed guns. It called the things it used to hush worlds. Long pale vessels, 400 of them, each one carrying a cutting engine that reached down into the deep structure of a world's connection and sawed it dead. The stillness had hushed 310 worlds with these. It brought all 400 to Veshen Drum, because it had decided that this fleet from the dark would be the 311th silence, and the largest, and that when it was done, no one would ever again be foolish enough to answer the forbidden band. EU watched the pale ships come from his window, 400 of them sliding into orbit around his world, and he felt his hope go thin and cold, because he could count, and 61 was a smaller number than 400. He said as much to the Long Watch, on the one rack in the hall that still carried its voice. He typed it plain. There are 400 of them, and 61 of you. They are going to hush you. You should run while you still can. You came for a voice. The voice is not worth 400 severings. Go. The answer was the calmest thing IU had ever read. Friend, count again. Count what they brought. They brought 400 cutters and not one gun. They have ruled the reach for 900 years, and they have forgotten how to fight, because they never had to. They only ever had to cut the wire. We are the people who learned to live with the wire cut. There is nothing they can do to us that has not already been done to us. You are not watching the weak meet the strong. You are watching the strong discover that their one weapon does not work on the people they made it to use it on. And then the Long Watch said one more thing, and EU read it 3 times, and then he printed it out and folded it and put it in his coat, because he wanted to keep it. Watch what we do not do. We will not cut them. We will not hush them. We could. We learned how. We will not. The stillness silences. We answer. That is the whole difference, and it is the whole war. Then the Long Watch went quiet, and the stillness made its move. 400 pale cutter ships turned their engines on the human fleet at once. EU felt it more than saw it. A deep wrongness in the air of the hall. A sound under sound. As 400 severing engines reached up into the high dark and sawed at the connection between the human ships, trying to cut them off from each other, to blind them, to make them as alone and unheard as 310 worlds before them. The severing hit the human fleet, and the human fleet did not go dark. EU would learn, later, why. The Long Watch had spent 900 years being the most severed people in the Reach. They had been cut off so completely, so early, that they had built every system they owned to work with the wire already cut. They did not pass signals between ships the way the rest of the Reach did, on bands that could be sawed through. They had learned, in their long dark, to coordinate the way a flock of birds coordinates, the way EU's gray bird would have turned with 100 others if it had ever been free, each hull watching its neighbors, and moving as one body without a single word passing between them. There was no wire to cut. The stillness sawed at the dark between the ships, and found nothing there to saw, because the humans had stopped putting anything in the dark between ships 900 years ago. The severing washed over the fleet, and did nothing at all. And the human fleet began, for the first time, to move with intent. It did not charge, it did not roar in, it spread. 61 hulls opened out across the high dark over Veshin Drum like a hand laying flat, slow and unhurried, until each pale cutter ship of the stillness found a single human hull sliding into position above it, patient, silent, close. Then, we never stopped listening spoke, on every band at once, to the cutter ships, to EU's hull, to the 400 crews of the stillness who had spent their lives sawing the throats of worlds. You spend your lives making sure no one can be heard. We are going to do something worse to you than killing you. We are going to make you listen. And the human fleet played them the worlds. EU's rack came alive with it, and so did every rack in the Reach, and so did every speaker on all 400 pale cutter ships. The Long Watch had been listening for 900 years, and it had not only listened for one mistake on the silent band, it had listened to everything. It had recorded every world the stillness had ever hushed, every last call those worlds had managed to make before the wire was cut, every final cry from 310 planets across 9 centuries, all the voices the stillness had spent its whole existence making sure no one would ever hear. And it played them all, at once, into the ears of the creatures who had cut them. The first cries from a world called Mehed Vol, 900 years dead quiet, a child's voice asking why the sky had stopped answering. The last broadcast of the orbital cities of Osun, 800 years hushed, 10,000 people calling out into a dark that had already been sealed, not knowing yet that no one would come. The final transmission of a place the records only called the Ninth Garden, a single old voice saying, over and over, until the wire was cut mid-word, "We are still here, we are still here, we are still." 400 cutter crews heard the worlds they had hushed. Some of them had cut those worlds themselves. The stillness used the same engines for 900 years. The same families crewed them. The creature that had sawed Mehed Vol silent had grandchildren on the cutters over Veshin Drum, and those grandchildren heard the child's voice asking why the sky had stopped answering, and they could not cut it, because you cannot sever a sound that is already inside your own hull, playing on your own speakers, put there by a fleet that learned long ago that the wire could not be trusted. The stillness had one weapon. It cut the call. The humans had filled all 400 ships with the calls the stillness had cut, and there was no wire to saw, because the call was already there. IU watched the pale ships through his window, and he saw something he did not understand at first. They were going dark, not destroyed, dark. One by one, the cutter ships of the stillness powered down their severing engines and went still, and it took IU a long time to understand that they were not being beaten. They were stopping. Crew after crew, hull after hull, the people of the stillness heard the worlds they had hushed, and they stopped. They could not do it anymore. You can saw a wire when you have been told the thing on the other end is empty. You cannot saw it when you can hear a child on the other end asking why the sky stopped answering. The stillness had ruled for 900 years by making sure its own people never heard the worlds they hushed, and the humans had simply, gently, made them hear. Sarn Vale, in the doorway of IU's hall, heard it too. The gray overseer stood with its back against the frame and listened to 900 years of cut-off voices pour out of the relay racks it had spent its life keeping silent. And IU watched the doubt that had begun in its eyes spread down through the whole of it, until the tall gray shape that had lifted him off his feet an hour ago slid slowly down the doorframe and sat on the floor of the relay hall with its head in its hands. "I cut a world," Sarn Vale said. "Once. Early. They told me it was empty. They told me there was nothing on the other end. I cut it, and I went home, and I slept. It told the floor of the relay hall this, quietly, while the voices played. I slept, it said again, as if the word was the worst thing it had ever done. Iju Marn, who had no rank worth saying, and had never held a weapon, crossed the hall and sat down on the cold floor next to the overseer of the stillness, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, and the two of them sat there together and listened to the voices of 310 worlds that someone, finally, after 900 years, had bothered to hear. Above them, 61 human hulls held station over a world they had never seen, and did not fire one shot, and 400 pale cutter ships, of the most feared power in the Reach, sat dark and silent in the high, cold dark, undone not by guns, but by being made, at last, to listen to what they had done. The long watch came up on EU's rack one more time. The message was short. Tell the gray one beside you that it is not too late to start answering. It is never too late to start answering. That is the only thing we came 900 years to say. EU read it aloud to Sarn Vael, on the floor, in the dark, with the voices of the dead quiet worlds playing soft around them both, and the overseer of the stillness lifted its head and looked at the clerk it had nearly killed, and for the first time in its long gray life, it said the words its masters had spent 9 centuries making sure no one in the Reach ever said. How do I answer? The other hulls of the Long Watch were not idle, while the flagship held its station, and what they did across those days, world by world, is the part of the story the Reach tells most, because it is the part where the silence broke, not in one place, but everywhere at once. There were 61 hulls, and after the cutters went dark, 60 of them peeled away from Veshin Drum, one by one, slow and certain, and each one folded out toward a different hushed world. The Long Watch had a list. It had carried the list for 900 years. Every world the stillness had ever silenced, in the order they had been silenced, 310 names, and the fleet had only 60 hulls to send, so it sent them to the oldest first, the worlds that had been quiet the longest, the ones most likely to have forgotten entirely that the sky was ever anything but a lid. Au followed it on the racks. He could not see it, but he could hear it, world by world, as the silence lifted. A hull called Late But Here folded out of the dark over a world named Osun, 800 years hushed, the world whose orbital cities had once called out to 10,000 voices into a sealed sky. It did not fire, it did not land. It opened every band over Osun, and it played the world its own last broadcast. The 10,000 voices from 800 years ago, the cry the stillness had cut mid-word, and then, when the recording reached the place where the wire had been sawed, where for 800 years there had been only silence, the hull spoke the rest of the sentence. It finished what Osun had been trying to say when it was cut off, and the people of Osun, who had been taught for 8 centuries that their ancestors had simply stopped, fallen quiet, given up, heard for the first time that their ancestors had not stopped at all, that they had been silenced in the middle of a call, and that someone had finally come to finish it. A world wept all at once. The records say the grief and the joy of it could be heard, faintly, on the open band, for days. A hull called We Kept Your Name folded over a world the maps called only the Ninth Garden, whose single old voice had said, "We are still here," until the wire cut the word in half. The hull found the Ninth Garden alive, barely, a thin and faded people who no longer had a word for sky in their language, because they had stopped looking up generations ago. The hull did not try to teach them anything. It simply began to answer. Every day, on the open band, a voice from the dark saying, we hear you, until the people of the Ninth Garden, slowly, like a thing thawing, began to look up again, and to teach their children that the word for sky was not lid, was not ceiling, was not the dead gray nothing the stillness had made of it, but door. A hull called No One Is Alone folded over a world that had been hushed so long it had no name left in the records at all, only a number. The hull gave it a name. It asked the people what they wished to be called, now that they could be called anything, and the people, who had not been asked a question by the sky in 900 years, took a long time to answer, and when they did, the name they chose was Answered, and the hull entered it into the open record of the Reach, the first world in 9 centuries to name itself, and the name held. 60 hulls, 60 worlds, and behind each one, the silence lifting in a widening circle, because every world that woke began at once to call the worlds nearest it, and those woke and called the next, so that the long watch did not have to reach all 310. It only had to start the oldest 60, and the Reach did the rest itself. The way a fire does not need to be lit in every room if you light it in enough of them, the call spreading hand to hand and world to world across 900 years of dark, faster than any fleet could fly, because a voice, once it is allowed, travels at the speed of the dark itself. EU sat at his racks and listened to a galaxy he had been taught was empty turn out to be full, world after world after world, all of them alive, all of them having waited, all of them finally able to say so. He had spent 19 years certain that the sky was a quiet place. He learned, in those days, that it had never been quiet at all. It had only been gagged, and the difference between a quiet sky and a gagged one is the difference between an empty room and a room full of people who have all been forbidden to speak, and the Long Watch had spent 900 years learning that difference by heart, and had crossed the whole dark to teach it to everyone else. One hull stayed, the flagship. We never stopped listening, held its station over Veshin Drum, and did not go to any world, and EU wondered why the largest ship, the one that could have woken the most worlds, was the one that stayed still, and he asked the Long Watch, and the Long Watch told him. Because the call came from here, it said. You called us, friend, by accident, on a stuck tone, and we do not leave the one who called until the calling is done. The others wake the Reach. We stay with you. That is the rule we have kept for 900 years, the rule the stillness never understood, the rule that is the whole of why we win. You do not abandon the voice that reached you. You stay. You answer. You finish. And we are not finished here. There is still a world we have not found, and you are the one who is going to find it, though you do not know that yet. EU did not understand that yet. But he kept his racks running, and over Veshin Drum, the flagship of the Long Watch, held its long, patient station, and across the Reach, the silence kept lifting, world by waking world, and the stillness watched 300 years of its work come undone in a handful of days, and could not find a single hand willing to stop it. The throne of the stillness was a long way from Veshin Drum, and it did not sit on the floor of a relay hall and weep, because thrones never do. The throne was a place called the Quiet Seat, an old gray station hanging over a starless patch of sky, and the creature that ruled it had ruled for 200 cycles, and had no name, because the stillness had taught that a ruler with no name could not be called, and a thing that cannot be called cannot be challenged. It was simply the first silence. The first silence watched 400 of its cutter ships go dark over Veshin Drum, and it did not panic, because it had one more move, the move the stillness had always kept for the end, the move it had never once had to use in 900 years. It could sever a world entire, not cut its signals. Cut the world. The stillness had a single greatest engine, a thing it had built 9 centuries ago, and hidden, and prayed it would never need, an engine that did not saw one wire, but cut every connection on a planet at once, every voice, every call, every link between mind and mind, leaving a world full of living creatures who could no longer hear each other at all. A whole planet hushed in one stroke, every person on it sealed alone inside their own skull, a world of the loud made into a world of the silent in a single afternoon. The first silence turned that engine on Veshin Drum, because if it could not stop the human fleet, it would take away the thing the human fleet had come for. It would hush the world the clerk had called from. It would make Veshin Drum so silent, so completely, and finally cut off, that the humans would arrive home to find nothing but a planet of creatures sitting alone in the dark, unable to hear the fleet that had crossed 900 years to reach them. It would make the answer arrive too late to matter. It would prove, one last time, that silence always wins, because silence is patient, and the call is fragile. The greatest engine of the stillness woke. Its cut began to reach down toward Veshin Drum, toward EU's gray mountain, toward the relay hall and the overseer learning to weep, and the clerk and his small gray bird and every other living soul on the world, a severing the size of a planet, falling. The Long Watch saw it coming. Of course it did. The Long Watch had spent 900 years learning every shape of severing the stillness could make, because it had survived all of them. It knew the great engine. It had been waiting, in a way, for the stillness to reach for it, because the Long Watch understood something about the creature on the quiet seat that the creature did not understand about itself. A power that rules by cutting the call has only one move, and a people who have survived having their call cut for 900 years have learned that one move by heart. There is a thing the first silence did, in the last hours before it woke the great engine, that IU never saw and only learned about long after, when the Reach had pieced the war together from 1,000 racks, and it is worth telling, because it is the moment the ruler of 1,100 worlds came closest to understanding what it was about to lose. The first silence went down into the deepest archive of the quiet seat, alone, to the locked record that only the throne could open, and it read the founding of the stillness for the first time in 200 cycles. Not the version the Reach was taught, the true one, the one the first throne had sealed 900 years ago. It learned that the stillness had not begun as a power, it had begun as a wound. 900 years ago, the world that would become the first throne had called out into the dark, in terror, with a real and desperate need, a world dying and begging the Reach for help. And the Reach had heard it, and the Reach had done nothing. The neighboring worlds had calculated the cost of answering, and found it too high, and they had let the call go unanswered, and the dying world had died, all but a handful, and that handful had crawled out of the ash of their home, with a single conviction burned into them so deep, it became the law of the galaxy. If the call goes unanswered, then the call is the lie. If reaching out brings only silence, then teach everyone that reaching out is death, and they will stop reaching, and they will never feel what we felt, the long horror of calling, and calling into a dark that will not answer. The stillness had been built by a people who had called for help and been abandoned, and who had decided, out of that abandonment, that the kindest thing they could do for the whole Reach was to make sure no one ever called again. Cut the throat of the call, and you cut the possibility of being abandoned. A world that cannot ask for help can never be refused it. The stillness was not cruelty, it was grief. 900 years old, frozen into an empire, a galaxy gagged by the descendants of a people who could not bear that they had once cried out, and no one had come. The first silence read this alone in the dark, and it understood, for the first time, that it was the air of an unanswered call. And then it understood the thing that broke it, the thing it could not hold, the thing it woke the great engine to drown out so it would not have to keep knowing it. The humans were the call answered. That was the whole difference. The stillness was what you build when you call and no one comes. The Long Watch was what you build when you decide that, no matter how long it takes, no matter how cut and how silenced and how forgotten you are, you will be the one who comes. Two peoples, both abandoned, both severed, both grieving. One had spent 900 years making sure no one could ever call. The other had spent 900 years making sure that, when someone finally did, there would be a fleet already listening. They were mirror images. They were the same wound, healed two opposite ways. And the first silence, reading its own true founding in the dark, understood that the war over Veshan Drum was not a war between strength and weakness at all. It was a war between two answers to the same question. The oldest question in the dark. When you call out, will anyone come? The stillness's answer was no, and make it law. The Long Watch's answer was yes, and make it a fleet. And the first silence, heir to the no, sat in the deep archive of its throne and felt the law it had inherited begin to crack, because it had just learned that the whole of its empire was built to spare the Reach a pain that the humans had simply chosen, instead, to end. You did not have to gag the galaxy to make sure no one was ever abandoned. You only had to be willing to answer. The humans had been willing. For 900 years, in the cold, with the wire cut, they had been willing. And the first silence had spent the same 900 years making sure no one could be. It woke the great engine to drown the knowing out. It turned the largest silence it had ever made on Veshan Drum, not because it believed silence would win anymore, but because it could not bear, in those last hours, to sit alone with the understanding that it had spent 200 cycles building a monument to a call that the humans had answered for free. The engine was not a weapon, in the end. It was the first silence trying, one last time, to make the galaxy as quiet as the inside of its own grief, so that it would not have to hear that the answer it had given to the oldest question in the dark had been wrong, all along, and that a clerk with a stuck tone and a fleet that never stopped listening were about to prove it to 1,100 worlds at once. The engine emptied itself against one human hull and accomplished nothing, and then the human flagship spoke the first silence's true name, the name of the child whose call had gone unanswered, and the ruler of 1,100 worlds understood, in the moment of being named, that the call had finally, 900 years late, been answered after all. Someone had come. It had simply taken until now, and the one who came had a hull the size of a moon, and it had crossed the whole dark not to conquer the stillness, but to do the one thing the stillness had been built around the absence of. To hear it, to come, to answer. We Never Stopped Listening turned and put itself between the great engine's cut and the world of Vesh and Drum. This is the part you need to watch closely, because it is the part the stillness could not have predicted, and it is the part that no power by silence had ever once survived. The flagship of the Long Watch did not shoot the engine. It could have. It chose not to. Instead, it did the thing the Long Watch had spent 9 centuries learning to do, the thing it had built every hull and every mind, and every cold patient year toward. It caught the silence. The great cut fell toward Vesh and Drum, and the human flagship opened itself to it, and took the whole severing into its own hull, the way a creature throws its own body over a child. The cut that had been meant to hush a planet poured into one ship instead. Every connection on We Never Stopped Listening began to sever at once, ship to ship, mind to mind, system to system, the engine doing to one hull what it had been built to do to a world. And We Never Stopped Listening did not go dark, because it had been built, every plate of it, by the most severed people in the Reach, to keep working with every wire cut. The humans had spent 900 years building hulls that did not need to be connected to function, minds that did not need a wire to stay together, a fleet that flew like a flock and not like a chain. The greatest engine of the stillness cut every connection on the human flagship and found, exactly as the 400 cutters had found, that there were no connections to cut, that the humans had stopped depending on the wire so long ago that severing it changed nothing at all. The great engine poured the largest cut in 900 years into a single human hull, and the hull simply took it, and held, and did not go dark, and did not stop. And across the high cold sky, the 11 words went out again, steady as a heartbeat. On every band the engine was burning out trying to silence them. We heard a voice in the dark. We are coming home. The engine cut until it had nothing left to cut with. It had been built for a world. It spent itself on one ship. And when it was empty, when the largest silence the stillness had ever made had poured itself out against a single human flagship and broken on it like a wave on a stone, the engine went dark, and the cut stopped, and Vesh and Drum, the whole living world of it, every soul on it, stood under a sky that had not been hushed. The first silence, on its starless throne, watched its last and greatest weapon empty itself against one hull and accomplish nothing, and felt, for the first time in 200 cycles, the thing it had spent its life making sure no one in the Reach could ever feel. It felt heard. Because the human flagship, having caught the great cut and held it and survived it, now turned the full weight of its attention onto the quiet seat, and onto the nameless creature that ruled there, and it spoke to the first silence directly, on the throne's own private band, the one band the first silence had always believed only it could use. "We know your name," the Long Watch said. And it said the name. Not a title. Not first silence. The creature's true name, the one it had been born with, 200 cycles ago, on a world that the records said no longer existed, a name it had buried so deep and so long ago that it had nearly forgotten it itself, the name of a small child, on a small world, before that world taught it that a ruler must have no name, so that it can never be called. The Long Watch had been listening for 900 years. It had heard everything. It had even heard, long ago, before the throne, the sound of one frightened child on a hushed world, calling out a name into a dark that did not answer, and it had kept that name, the way it kept all of them, and now it gave the name back to the creature that had spent 200 cycles, making sure no one could ever say it. "We know your name," the Long Watch said again, gently, the way you tell a frightened animal a hard truth. You were called once, and no one answered, and so you decided no one would ever be answered again. We are sorry. We came as fast as we could. It only took us 900 years to learn how to reach the band they cut. You are not the first silence. You are a child whose call went unanswered, and we are answering it now. We are late. We are so late. But we came. The first silence, ruler of 1100 worlds, sat on its starless throne and heard its own name spoken aloud for the first time in 200 cycles. By a voice that had crossed 9 centuries of dark to say it, and it broke. Not in defeat, in something far older than defeat, the thing the stillness had been built, brick by brick and world by world, to make sure never happened. A creature that ruled by silence, finally, after a lifetime, heard, answered, called by name. It did not order another severing. There were no more to order. It sat in the long quiet of its throne, and somewhere very deep inside it, a small thing that had been waiting 200 cycles to be heard finally was. And the first silence put its hands over its face, exactly as Sarn Vale had on the floor of EU's relay hall, exactly as 400 cutter crews had over the worlds they had hushed, and the whole great machinery of the stillness, 1100 worlds of enforced quiet, ground slowly to a stop, not because it was destroyed, but because the creatures running it had, all at once, across the entire reach, finally heard what they had done, and could not, would not, do it anymore. You cannot make a creature go silent that has just been called by name for the first time in its life. EU Marn knew none of this yet. He was still on the floor of his relay hall, beside the weeping overseer, listening to the voices of the dead quiet worlds. But the racks around him changed. Across the reach, on 310 hushed worlds, the severings began to lift, not because the humans cut them open, because the creatures who ran the stillness, hearing for the first time, began, one by one, to turn the cutting engines off. The wire, after 900 years, came back, and on 310 worlds that had been taught the sky was empty, the sky began, very quietly, to fill with the sound of everyone else, suddenly, finally, able to hear each other again. In the days after the great engine emptied itself, while the silence lifted and the reach woke, and the flagship held its station, the stillness did not simply vanish, and IU wants you to understand that, because the easy story is that the bad thing ended and everyone was happy, and that is not what happened, and the truth is better. The stillness had 1100 worlds full of officers and engines and habits, 900 years deep, and not all of them heard the voices and wept. Some heard them and were afraid, and a frightened old power is the most dangerous thing in the dark, and there was a faction of the Concord, far from Veshan Drum, that decided the answer to a fleet that could not be cut was to do the one thing the stillness had always forbidden itself, to build a gun, to stop ruling by silence, and start ruling by force. To meet the Long Watch the way you are imagining a war should be met, with hulls and fire. This faction gathered at a place called the Grey Anvil, an old forge station the stillness had never used, because the stillness had never needed weapons, and it began, in a panic, to arm. It took its cutter ships, and it tried to hang guns on them. It pulled the severing engines out and bolted on the crude beginnings of a war fleet, and it sent word across what was left of the Concord that the silence had failed, and now there would be fire, and it turned that half-built fleet toward Veshan Drum to do by force what the cutters could not do by silence. The Long Watch let it come. This is the part that tells you what the humans were. The faction at the Grey Anvil built its guns for 40 days, in a frenzy, certain that strength was the answer it had refused for 900 years, and the Long Watch knew about it the whole time, because the Long Watch heard everything, and it did not move to stop it, and EU, watching from his racks, did not understand why the fleet would let a war fleet arm itself in the open. He asked. The Long Watch answered. Because a gun built in panic is built by creatures who have already lost the argument, it said. The stillness ruled for 900 years and never needed a single gun, and the moment it reaches for one, every world watching learns the truth, that the silence was the only strength it ever had, and the silence is broken. Let them build their fleet. Let the whole reach see the great stillness, the power that hushed 310 worlds, reduced to bolting crude guns onto cutters, because it has nothing else left. The gun is not a threat to us, friend. The gun is a confession. We will let them finish it, so that everyone can read it. The half-built war fleet of the Grey Anvil came to Veshin Drum, 40 hulls of bolted on fire, and it found the human flagship waiting, alone, unmoved, and it opened fire, the first shots fired in the whole war, fired by the stillness, in panic, after 900 years of needing none. The shots struck the human hull and did nothing. We Never Stopped Listening had been built by the most severed people in the Reach, to survive everything the stillness could do, and it turned out that the Long Watch had not only built against silence, it had built against the day the silence failed, and the frightened old power finally reached for fire, because the humans understood, as the stillness never had, that a power which rules by one weapon will always, in its last hour, reach for the opposite, and you must be ready for both. The crude guns of the Grey Anvil broke against a hull 900 years in the making, and the human flagship did not fire back, did not need to, simply stood in the fire and let the whole Reach watch the stillness shoot and shoot and shoot at a thing it could not scratch. Then We Never Stopped Listening spoke to the war fleet, on every band, so that all 1100 worlds could hear the offer, the same offer the Long Watch made to everyone, the only offer it ever made. You have spent 900 years making sure no one could call for help. Now you are calling, with these guns, as loud as you can, and do you understand what you are saying? You are saying you are afraid. You are saying you do not want to be silenced. You are saying, in the only language you have left, help, and we heard you. We hear you. Put down the guns. No one is going to hush you. No one is going to abandon you. You called, and we came, and we are not the stillness, and we will not do to you what you did to the Reach. Power down. Be witnesses, not weapons. There is a place for you in the Reach that can hear itself. There is a place for everyone. That is the whole point. That is the only point there has ever been. The war fleet of the Grey Anvil ran out of fire. Its crude guns burned themselves empty against a hull that would not break, and one by one, the bolted-on weapons went cold, and the 40 hulls hung in the dark over Veshin Drum, spent, having said the only thing the stillness had left to say, and the human flagship had heard it as a call for help, and answered it as one. And there was nothing left to fight, because you cannot fight a thing that keeps insisting on hearing your attack as a cry, and answering it with mercy. The Grey Anvil powered down, the crews came out of their hulls, and the Long Watch took them in, and gave them the same thing it gave everyone, a name, and an open band, and the right to be heard, and some of them wept, and some of them did not, and all of them stopped being the stillness, because the stillness had just shot everything it had at the future, and the future had answered, shoot all you like, we still hear you, we still came, and there is no power in the dark that can stand against being forgiven by the thing it tried to kill. EU watched the last guns of the stillness go cold, and he understood the shape of the whole war then, the shape the Long Watch had seen from the first day. The stillness had two weapons, silence, and, at the very end, fire. The Long Watch had one answer, and it was the same answer to both. We hear you, we came. And it turned out that one answer was stronger than both weapons, because silence cannot survive being heard, and fire cannot survive being forgiven. And the Long Watch had spent 900 years becoming a people who could do both at once, to anyone, no matter what they did, and that is a thing no empire built on a wound has ever been able to defeat. It took 11 days for the silence to finish lifting, and IU Marn spent every one of them in the relay hall, because he could not have left if he had wanted to. The Reach woke up. That is the only honest way to say it. 310 worlds that had not heard a voice from the sky in 9 centuries began to hear, all at once, everything, not just the human fleet, each other. Worlds that had been hushed 200 years apart found, the moment the wire came back, that they were neighbors, that they had been calling out side by side into the same dark for lifetimes, each one believing it was the only one left. The relay racks in IU's hall, every one of them, filled with the sound of strangers finding strangers, of worlds saying their own names out loud after centuries of being forbidden to, of the most ordinary words in the Reach. Hello, is anyone there? We are here, we hear you, said for the first time in 900 years, and meaning everything. EU kept the racks running. It was the only thing he knew how to do, and now it was the most important thing on the world. He had spent 19 years making dead machines cough out a proof-of-life note that no one ever listened to, and now every machine in his hall was carrying the proof of life of a whole reach coming back from the silent, and he tended them the way he had always tended them, one rack at a time, with his sore back and his bad knee, except that now, when he reached the end of a row, he was weeping, and he did not bother to stop. Sarn Vale learned to answer. The overseer never put its uniform back on. It took the cut mark off its collar with its own hands on the second day, and it left it on the floor of the hall, and it never picked it up again. It stayed in the relay hall with AU, and it learned, slowly, clumsily, the way a creature learns a thing it should have learned as a child, how to take a call and answer it. The first world Sarn Vale answered, by hand, on IU's rack, was Mehed Vol, the world whose child's voice it had heard asking why the sky stopped answering, the world it had not cut, but whose cutting it had let happen. It typed, with the overseer's careful gray hands, the only words it had, "We are sorry. We are here now. We are listening." And a voice came back from Mehed Vol, 900 years after the wire was cut. A voice that did not yet know how to forgive, but knew, at least, that it had been heard. And it said, simply, "We waited a long time," and Sarn Vale read it, and sat very still for a long while, and then it answered the next world, and the next. The human fleet stayed in orbit for 11 days, and it did not come down. EU found this strange, and he asked the Long Watch about it on the rack, the one band that still carried its voice, and the Long Watch answered the way it answered everything, slow and plain and certain. "We are not your masters," it said. "We did not come to rule you. The stillness ruled. Look where it left you. We came to answer a call, and the call is answered, and the reach can hear itself again, and that is the whole of what we came to do. We will not land and put up a flag and tell you that now you belong to us. You have belonged to enough things. You belong to yourselves now. That is what answering a call means. You come, and you help, and then you let go. But," the Long Watch added, after a pause, "there is one thing we came home for, and we have not found it, and we would ask your help." EU typed, "What do you need?" The Long Watch told him. 900 years ago, when the stillness had hushed the human homeworld, the small people who would become the Long Watch had not all been on their ships. Some had been left behind, on the surface, when the severing fell, cut off, sealed alone. A whole world of them hushed, taught the sky was empty, made to forget that calling was real, exactly like the 310 worlds after them. The fleet that became the Long Watch had escaped into the dark, and built its long patience, and waited for the band to open, but it had never been able to reach its own homeworld. It had never been able to reach the ones it left behind. 900 years of listening, and the one voice the Long Watch had wanted most to hear, the voice of its own lost home, had stayed silent, because its own home was hushed too deep. "We came home," the Long Watch said. "We have been saying it since the first day. We heard a voice in the dark, and we are coming home. But we did not come home for Veshin Drum, friend, with all our love for it. We came home because when the band opened, when the silence lifted across the reach, we have hoped for 900 years, that somewhere in all the worlds waking up, we would finally hear them. Our own, the ones we left. We have been listening for 11 days. We have not heard them yet. We are afraid we are too late." EU Marn read that, and then he did the thing that clerks do, the thing that is so small it never makes the records, the thing that turns out to be the whole point. He went and looked. He went to the deep racks, the old ones, the dead ones, the transmitters so ancient that no one had run a test tone on them in living memory because everyone assumed they led nowhere, the forbidden band's neighbors, the channels that touched the silent quarter. He ran the proof of life note on every one of them, all night, one rack at a time, with his bad knee, and his weeping, and his small gray bird watching from its cage, the way he had run them 10,000 times before, except now he was not ticking a box. He was knocking on every door in the dark to see if anything was still alive behind it. On the third night, on a rack so old its label had worn to nothing, something knocked back. It was faint. It was 900 years faint. It was the proof of life note coming back changed, the way it comes back only when something on the other end has heard it and answered it on purpose. And Iyu Marn sat down at the dead rack with his heart going hard, exactly the way it had gone the night the connector stuck, and he listened, and under the static, in a trade speech so old it was barely the same language, a voice said, "We are still here, we are still here. Is anyone?" And Iyu, with his hands shaking, the clerk who had started all of this with a mistake, typed back the 11 words he had read off his screen on the very first day, the words he had folded into his coat and kept. We heard a voice in the dark. "We are coming home." He sent it down the dead rack, into the deep silence, toward the world the Long Watch had left behind 900 years ago and never stopped grieving. Then he ran, as fast as his bad knee would carry him, to the rack that still held the Long Watch's voice, and he typed the only thing that mattered, the thing a clerk types when he has, against all the odds of his small and ordinary life, found the one thing that the strongest fleet in the Reach could not find for itself. "I found them. You're home. They are still there. They are still alive." A clerk found them on a dead rack with a test tone. "They have been answering for 900 years. No one was ever listening on the right channel. I heard them. They are here. Come home." The Long Watch went silent for a long time, longer than it had ever been silent, and when it came back, the calm was gone from it, the 900 years of patient, certain calm, and what came up on EU's rack was not the careful voice of a fleet that had waited 9 centuries. It was just a voice, a small one, a voice that had been holding itself together for 900 years and had, finally, in the middle of a relay hall on a world it had never seen, let go. "Say it again," the Long Watch said. "Please, say it again." And EU said it again. The fleet that had crossed 900 years of dark, 61 hulls, that had caught the largest silence ever made, and held it and broken it, turned in the high cold sky over Veshin Drum, and for the first time since it had answered a stuck maintenance tone, it moved with something that was not patience. It moved toward its own home. The flagship We Never Stopped Listening swung its moon-sized hull toward the dead channel EU had opened, toward the faint 900-year voice that had never once stopped saying, "We are still here," to a dark that had never once answered, and it folded out of orbit, and the last thing it sent down to EU's hull, before it went, was 4 words. "Thank you," we heard. Veshin Drum stood under an open sky, and the Reach hummed and wept and found itself, and EU Marn sat down at the dead rack that had carried the Lost Home's voice, and he did not move for a long time, because he understood now what he had been for, all those 19 years of running a test tone no one listened to. He had been the one who would still be listening on the channel everyone else had given up on. That was all. That was everything. The fleet found its home 11 days later. EU heard about it the way the whole Reach heard about it, on every open band at once. A sound that no one in 900 years had been able to make. The sound of a people coming home, to a people who had waited. The two halves of a world that had been cut down the middle, 9 centuries ago, finding each other again across the dark. And there were no words in it that EU could repeat, because it was not made of words. It was made of every name that had gone unsaid for 900 years, said at last, out loud, by the ones who had been waiting to say them, and the ones who had been waiting to hear. Yu kept the printout of the Lost Homeworld's first answer for the rest of his life, the faint 900-year voice that had said "We are still here" into a dark that never answered, and he understood, in the way you only understand the most important things slowly, that he had not really found a world that night on the dead rack. He had found the proof of a thing the whole Reach had been built to deny. The ones who are left behind do not stop calling. That was the lesson. And the stillness had spent 900 years and 1100 worlds trying to bury it. A hushed world looks silent from the outside. The maps draw it gray. The records call it dead. But EU had run a test tone down a channel everyone had given up on, and a world 9 centuries severed had answered on the first knock, because it had never once stopped. Because no one who is cut off ever truly stops. They only stop being heard. And those are not the same thing, and the difference is the whole reason the Long Watch had been able to win. The Long Watch had simply refused to confuse a gagged sky for an empty one. It had kept listening on the dead channels, and so, in the end, had a clerk. When the fleet found its home, it did not find a ruin. It found a people thin and faded and changed, who no longer remembered the names of the ones who had flown away, who had been taught for 900 years that the sky was a lid, and that the ships that left them had abandoned them. The hardest part of the homecoming was not the joy, it was that. The ones left behind had spent 9 centuries believing they were forgotten, and the ones who flew had spent 9 centuries unable to tell them otherwise. And now the two halves of one people had to learn, slowly, across the gap of 900 years, that neither had ever stopped reaching for the other, that the silence between them had been built by someone else, on purpose, to make each believe the other was gone. The Long Watch told its lost home the truth in the plainest words it had. We did not leave you. We were cut from you. We have been calling your name every day for 900 years, on the one band they could not hear. You could not hear us. We could not reach you, but we never stopped. Listen. Here is the record. 900 years of us saying your name into the dark. We did not forget you for one single day. We just could not be heard. And now we can. And we came. We came as fast as the dark would let us. And it took everything we had. And here we are. And you are still here. And that is all that was ever true. We are still here. Both of us. We always were. Sarnvale wept again, in the relay hall, and so did Ayu. And so, somewhere, did the creature that had once been the first silence, who had been called by name, and could not stop hearing it. The Long Watch did not forget the clerk. A long while after, when the Reach had learned how to be loud again, when 310 worlds had remembered their own names, and the cutting engines had all been turned to scrap, and the silent band had been declared, by common voice of every world that could finally vote, the one band that must never again be banned, a small craft came down out of the high dark over Veshin Drum, and landed on the cold mountain by the relay hall. It was from the homeworld, from the ones who had been found. They came to meet the clerk who had heard them on a dead rack when no one else was listening, and they brought him nothing grand, because they understood, as the Long Watch understood, what the gift should be. They brought him a transmitter, a small one, new, built to run on the silent band, the open band, the band that could no longer be cut, so that Ayu Marn, who had spent his whole life sending a proof of life note that no one answered, would always, for the rest of his days, have one channel open to the dark, and would always, if he sent his small note into it, hear something answer back. He kept it by his desk, next to the cage with the small gray bird he had named after his mother. And on the quiet nights, on the third shifts, when the hall was dark and the racks hummed soft with the sound of a Reach that could finally hear itself, the clerk would send his 3-second note out into the open band, the proof that he was still there, still listening, and out of the dark a voice would always answer, sometimes the homeworld, sometimes Mehed Vol, sometimes a world he had never met, that had only just learned it was allowed to call, and the voice would say the thing the whole Reach had learned from one stuck connector, and one clerk who did not erase what he was told to erase. We heard you. You are not alone. Someone is always listening now. You are the kind of creature his masters were. Remember that. You would have logged the tone and gone back to sleep. You would have erased the message and never spoken of it. You would have looked at 61 hulls against 400 and called it hopeless. And you would have been wrong, because you measure strength in guns, and the Long Watch measured it in 900 years of refusing to stop answering. They did not mean to call humans. A connector corroded, and a tone stuck, and a clerk with a bad knee sent 9 seconds of nothing into a band the maps called empty. And humanity's warships came anyway. They always come. That is the whole of it. That is the thing the stillness spent 900 years and 1100 worlds trying to make sure no one would ever find out. Somewhere out past the edge of every map, on the one band no power has ever managed to cut, there is a fleet that never stopped listening, and it does not care whether you meant to call. It only cares that, at last, someone did.